Philip, welcome to the podcast. It is so great to have you here.
I'm so excited to be here.
Congratulations on the release of The Hideaway Inn, which came out last week as one of the first books out in the Karina Adores line.
I'm so excited that it's coming out and it's finally here. You know, you wait so long for something to actually make its debut. So now that it's here, I'm thrilled.
Well, you should be. I just loved everything about it. It just made me so happy. The story of Vince and Tack. Tell everybody what The Hideaway Inn's about from your point of view.
I really wanted to write a summer romance. So this is a book that has picnics and lemonade and fireflies after sunset and skinny dipping and all the things that are part of a summer romance. The story is about Vince, who returns to a place he was raised after reinventing himself, and he's created this armor. And Tack, the boy he loved in high school, he expects him to respond to him differently than he did when he had a crush on him. But Vince learns that his armor is really pushing people away instead of having the desired effect that he wants. And during this, it's about the relationship between protecting yourself from the world and letting the world in and making a balance. And I think that is really a story that queer people can relate to, in that we balance somehow being in the world and protecting ourselves while we're there, if that makes sense. And Vince really learns what it means to find love and be himself.
And the be himself, I mean, he goes through what I think many gay men do, where things go sideways in high school and you're always kind of battling your way back from that.
Yeah, I think that is such a astute way of putting it. You're always battling your way back from that. And I know that sounds insane in some ways. Like it sounds like, oh, it's such a long time. It's been a long time since I've been in high school.
Yeah, me too.
But I can tell you wounds like that and the way you make decisions about who you will be in the world. And certainly in terms of when you fall in love and when you kind of open yourself up to love in that way, are really impacted by that. And I really wanted to write a story about it.
Mm-hmm. Did you have specific inspirations for the story, touchstones that you had out there, things that you wanted to kind of tackle with it and present to people?
The inspiration for this particular story actually came a few years ago when my husband and I were in Beacon Hill in Boston. They have these brownstones, and some of them have these random purple window panes. And it's very strange. And I learned that in the 1880s, when they were transporting these windows from England, they had an imperfection in them. And it turned the panes purple during transit. But they installed them, and at first they were considered a flaw and a defect. And then later, they became a sign of status and something that was coveted and something people really thought was beautiful. And I remember hearing that story and thought, one day I'll write a story about something where somebody thinks it's a flaw, but it's actually the thing that makes them beautiful. And that's what this story became. Vince thinks he has to be a certain way, that his flaw is something he has to cover up, but he learns that he doesn't have to cover it up. That's the thing that makes him beautiful. So that was really the inspiration for these windows, which are actually called lavenders, which I think is lovely for a gay story.
Is this place real?
It's real in my head. New Hope is actually a totally real place. It's halfway between New York City and Philadelphia. It's on the banks of the Delaware River where Washington crossed. And it's not far from Washington's crossing. It has been historically a gay destination. Similar to Fire Island or P-Town, New Hope has always had this type of weekend getaway for queer people. In fact, the area, and I'm in Bucks County right now, this area used to be called the Genius Belt because Dorothy Parker's house was about 2 miles from where I'm sitting, and James Michener's backyard was behind our backyard, and Rodgers and Hammerstein composed and lived here. So this area has always had a strong artistic background, and that grew and grew with some drag history in the 60s and 70s and disco in the 80s. So New Hope is definitely a real place.
Does this inn exist, or did you put an inn where you wanted it to be?
In the words of Stephen Sondheim, I put an inn where there never was an inn. There is no Hideaway Inn, but there is an inn that this is based on that is in the same area. There isn't, the shops are wrong, or, there are different places, but the one place that is real is the Quack Shack, where he goes to feed the ducks. Mm-hmm. There is this little shack in New Hope called the Quack Shack, where you put like a quarter in and you get some duck food and you feed the ducks. Vince is really scared of these ducks. I am terrified of swans.
Swans are no joke. I mean, I've never personally had a swan go after me, but I've certainly heard tales.
I have. They have a very distinct network. So if one swan does not like you, it seems like all the swans know I am like a swan target. So that part's very real. The bridge is real. All of the other parts are definitely based. Actually, the 4th of July festival that they go to is a real festival that happens here. And it's exactly sort of what happens in town.
That's so cool. I like that this is a real place
mm-hmm.
that has real history. As I mentioned at the very top of our discussion, this is one of the very first books in the Karina Adores line of LGBTQ romances. How's it feel to have that designation?
Oh my God, it's so exciting to be the start of something. I'm thrilled, and I sort of fell into it in a very lucky way. I read Harlequin romances growing up as a kid. I've always been involved in that. That said, it's also totally terrifying, if I'm being honest, because the other people who are launching this, like Chelsea Cameron and Cole and Roan, are like master storytellers of romance and have wonderful followings and wonderful books. And I am totally new to this party. I'm a little self-conscious. I'm not sure if I'm wearing the right clothes or if I'm arriving at the right time or if I should have brought like a hostess gift or not. I'm not sure, but I'm still excited, and I'm hoping that once this comes out, there will be plenty of people who want to either dance with me or sit in the corner and watch other people dance. This is my first gay romance novel. I've written a lot of books in other genres, but this is the first actual gay romance novel I've ever written. So that's why I say I am brand new to the party. If you see me and I'm wearing a newcomer's badge, please come over and sit with me for a little bit, because I am really anxious to make new friends.
Well, if we ever get to not socially distance, we will come sit next to you.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Now, you've got a very inclusive book here, because not only do you have your heroes of Vince and Tack, who are obviously, gay, but you've populated this town and your supporting characters with a broad spectrum too, from Tack's child to the bookstore owner to the farmers. And I really love that aspect of it, and really how you use the supporting characters too to just expand on the overall queerness of the town. How did you decide how you were to populate New Hope and what characters you were going to, make sure we got to know pretty well?
Well, I definitely wanted to write a cozy town with like a Mitfordy feel, but gay. The gayest Mitford you could ever imagine. Like I wanted to actually make like a gay Thomas Kincaid painting. Which is maybe redundant, I'm not sure. And I love Thomas Kincaid, and my husband is like disgusted by Thomas Kincaid. So we had this clash of aesthetics there. But I wanted to write something that had a real range of queer people in it, because at the heart of this story, and I think I'm making it not sound like a very romancy romance. It is. Underneath that is a story also about gender expression, coming to terms with your own. And I wanted to populate it with people who would have that range. I don't, did you ever see, I'm sure you've seen the movie The Women from the 1930s, right? And you know, they redid it in 2008 with Diane English. And I remember really well in that movie, on set in the library, there were busts of men. Like there were like two or three, like way in the background. And the whole thing about that movie is they wanted to have only women on screen from start to finish in both versions. Like if you notice in both of them, all the extras, all of the smaller parts are women. And I remember way back then hearing that and thinking, wouldn't that be interesting if you could do that with gay and queer people? So that's how I populated this world. I wanted them all, I think, and I don't know if every single person in the book is gay, but I think so.
Which is just really wonderful. It gave me such a warm feeling because it is very romance forward. I mean, the romance of Tack and Vince is the story, but it's their support system around them and the people in their lives that just really flesh the world out.
And I wanted that part to have some more fantasy to it. And I wanted to balance that with making sure for me, the voice was as authentic as I could make it. So I was okay if the rest of it felt like, you know, that town might have non-gay people in it. So I really wanted to balance those two things. But I'm so glad that you found that community as a character in the book also, because I really tried to make it that.
Yeah, very, very much so. Were there any aspects of the story that I'm going to make you pick among your children now that were more fun for you to write than others? Because the book has so much heart. It just seems like, by and large, it would have been kind of fun to come up with the story and to put it on paper.
I've always had like a love for Americana, for kind of country fairs and small town things like that. Sort of anything you would see in Little House on the Prairie, like that type of aesthetic, that kind of Americana. And as a gay man, I've always liked that, but I've also felt a little outside of it. So anytime in this book where I could sit inside that world, I was so happy. They go to a 4th of July festival and hold hands there that I love. They go to a lavender farm and go to a goat cheese farm. They tube down the river. All of that type of things that, to me, growing up, I never knew if I would have access to those things. Giving these characters access to it made me feel really good. Does that make sense, I guess?
Yeah, it absolutely does.
I wanted there to be a place for them, and I wanted these characters to know, like, yeah, there's a place for you here.
So this particular episode is our very first one within Pride Month. And all this month, we're having authors come and read some selections from their work for us. And we're going to get to kick that off with you and a little bit of the Hideaway Inn. So what part of the book are you going to give to us?
So I'm reading a section from actually very near the end of the book, and this is where Vince is really questioning some of the choices and the mistakes that he's made since he returned to New Hope, and also since leaving New Hope. And he goes to the Museum of Modern Art, which is where I had my very first internship in college, and he's really thinking about those choices and the experiences of, they come from the experience of myself of being a young adult. And this part I'm going to read is somewhat personal to me in that when I was in high school, there was this guy, and if he saw me, my day was miserable. If he saw me, he would find me and start calling me names and teasing me or pushing me or shoving me or getting a bunch of other people to gang up on me. And it was awful. And as a teenager, I remember laying in bed and thinking, oh, if this guy has a good day tomorrow, then I can have a good day. Or if this guy, sits in a different part of the lunchroom, then I can be okay that day. And I remember thinking, I just want to be able to control my own experience as a kid, as going to school. Does that make sense? Like I wanted to say, and I always thought, and because I was teased for being effeminate, so I always thought, oh, if I could just not act that way, then I could control how other people treat me. And I couldn't actually pass for being very masculine. So I never really was able to develop that. But in the book, Vince is able to do that. And it's to his detriment because he thinks he's controlling the world by protecting himself from that. And this is the scene where he sort of begins to think that might not be such a good idea. Finally, I go to the Museum of Modern Art to visit my old friend, Cezanne's The Bather, a painting I've sort of had a thing for since I first saw it as a teen. The museum is crowded, but I'm able to stand right in front of the masterpiece. A teenage boy, painted in somber shades of blue, stands at the edge of the water in his swimsuit, with his hands on his hips. He looks down, avoiding eye contact with the observer. He is shy and unsure of himself, but also present in his surroundings. He is almost naked, but not in a sexual way. He is exposed, but also without pretense, without a facade. I used to identify with this boy so much. I used to think it was a portrait of me, but now I have much more in common with the suits of armor a few dozen blocks uptown at the Met. I'm rarely vulnerable, like the boy in the frame before me. I'm always wearing a shield that has been polished and maintained over the years, but I wonder if there is still a boy underneath. I used to think that painted boy was weak, like I was when I was a kid, but I realize now he isn't weak at all. Being a man isn't something you become or something you show people. I don't know what it is. I used to think it was the most important thing in the world. If I was a man, I could be safe. I wouldn't have my fate decided by people around me. If I could be a man in the way the world wanted me to be, maybe I would be worthy of love. I always thought that was the thing that stopped Tack from being with me. I wasn't worthy. I thought he was embarrassed of me. I spent my whole life trying to be worthy, and now I don't even know what that is. What's worse, I don't think it even matters. I think about Jules and their lack of interest in defining themselves. If I wasn't so worried all summer about showing Tack who I've become, maybe I'd have found a way to tell him the truth about everything. Maybe I'd be at the Hideaway Inn right now, sitting on the porch with both of them. I take in the blues and greens of Cezanne's brushstrokes. I just stand in front of the painting, like it's only me and the canvas, and nothing else exists in the world. I study it, not for the composition or use of color, but for what it says to me privately. Sir, I think you may need this, a frail woman with a walker says to me, pulling out a tissue from her sleeve. Excuse me, I say, breaking the spell. Here, she says, take as many as you need. She gives me her compact package of tissues and walks away. I hold them in my hand and suddenly see a drop of water dampen the tissue waiting to be pulled from the pack. For a moment, I think the ceiling at the museum has a leak, but then I realize it's a tear. I've been standing in front of the painting, crying, and I didn't even know it.
Thank you for sharing that. It became one of my favorite scenes in the book because it captures Vince so well and what he goes through.
He thinks he can protect himself from that, and he thinks that being an alpha is being a man. And that's all he knows from being in the world. And also he thinks that, and I mean, I have felt this so many times, especially as a kid. Oh, that person's embarrassed of me because I'm effeminate. I teach at NYU, and over my years there, I've noticed students change in these profound ways. When I was on campus as a student, I hid so much of myself because I was scared. In the beginning, it was like students kept being themselves more, gay students who were feminine or anywhere. And it changed over these years, whereas they were not trying to cover up anything at all. And as a teacher watching this, as a gay teacher watching this, it was so transformative for me. And I was with a student just this past semester, and they were telling me the story of their pronouns and their gender expression. And I've never really cried in front of a student before. I usually make my students cry, if I'm being honest. But I was so moved by their pride in themselves and their ability to be who they are without consideration of the things around them. And I told my husband this, and we both cried. And I didn't know if I was crying like I was happy for him, but I also thought, that is such a long time ago. I wonder who I would be if I was able to live my young adult life in that way. And the fact is, I don't know. And yeah. I don't know if you have that experience at all, or if you think that sometimes, or have that. I don't know. I don't know.
Most of my name calling came out of the fact that I lived in Alabama and didn't like football. I was very bookish, very into writing, even at a young age, and that kind of thing. So that, more than how I looked or sounded, played into why I got called names. And I didn't date either, but that was a whole other thing.
Were you able to pass?
Probably.
And that's where this book comes out of. So when people see him as a dick, they are seeing somebody who got there because of being a target of ridicule and a target of people's aggression. And when that happens to you long enough, you learn how to stop it.
Oh yeah.
And if you're Vince and you can, because you can pass, that's what you do, or that's what he does.
Yeah. So Seasons of New Hope is a series, and this is book 1. Are there things you can tease us about the future installments?
The next book takes place in winter, because I really wanted to write a seasonal series. And it's about an antiques dealer in New Hope. And here he's all set to move in, and he is an expert in the Second Empire and ornate candlesticks and furniture and pewterware, and everything matches and is perfect. And as he's moving into this antique store, he looks in the window and he sees a guy dressed in a Fozzie Bear t-shirt putting a Muppets lunchbox on a pedestal in the window of the store he's going to have to share with this guy. And it's about a collector who has things like Happy Meal toys and Barbies and Holly Hobby glasses and Snoopy stuff, and a guy who collects very staid metallurgy letter openers. And all the characters in the community from book 1, they all return to save these 2 historic buildings that are possibly going to be torn down, and they're 2 very different buildings that actually exist in New Hope, in the real New Hope. One is a mid-century bank, and the other is a Second Empire building next to it on the river. So it takes place in winter, so there's hot chocolate and ice sculptures and pot-bellied stoves and sledding and all the fun winter things.
Do you have a release date for the winter book?
January or February of 2021.
Perfect. So it releases in the right season. So you've got one other novella out, and you re-released it in April. It's called There Galapagos My Heart. Tell us a little bit about that book.
Well, that book is part of a series I'm working on called Love Beyond Boundaries, and they're all really travel books. I grew up always choosing, and I still do, I choose my books by location. And I'll sort of read anything if it takes place in Paris or if it takes place in the Napa Valley, like if that's what I feel like at that time. So I love heavy location books. And There Galapagos My Heart takes place obviously in Ecuador and the Galapagos Islands. Kiss You at Machu Picchu takes place in Peru. And My Cotswold Crush takes place in one of my favorite places in the world, the Cotswolds. My husband used to be the director of school programs at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And we did a lot of travel with the Met where we both lectured. So he would lecture about art and I would lecture about my area of specialization. And most of these travel books are sort of based on those experiences traveling with donors from the museum.
Very cool. Do you have a timeline for the other books in that series?
Is as soon as I can a timeline, or is that not really a timeline?
That's a timeline.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
fine. So the timeline is as soon as I can get to it.
Coming soon.
Coming soon, exactly.
So you mentioned also that you have written books in other genres, kind of going back to your origin story. What got you started as a writer?
Well, as a kid, I was definitely in a lot of creative writing programs, and I wasn't really sure if I wanted to do that. But, well, as I say, when you're a boy and you're at the Little League game playing left field, but you go out to the outfield with a copy of Family Circle or Ladies' Home Journal, and you're sitting in the outfield reading that, they pretty quickly ask you to take a creative writing class instead. And that's sort of where I was and what I did. And I didn't really identify as a writer for a very long time, but really started then, and I'm going to tell you as edited a version of the long story as possible. I went to a spiritual meeting of a guru of sorts. And I went with a friend, and I know you're thinking, where is this going? I've gone from Little League to a guru. I promise I'll get there. So I went to this meeting, and they said, oh, we're now going to sing this special song. And they sang this special song, and it just was so bad, it made me laugh so hard. I started getting the giggles during this solemn time. And this woman who I didn't know, this stranger next to me, started getting the giggles too. And so we had to leave the event. We were sort of got enough dirty looks to leave the event. And she and I escaped to the hallway and became friends. And it turns out she was a very well-known writer of women's fiction. And she was the type of writer where if you were at a bookstore in an airport, there would be multiple books of hers on the shelves. So I became friends with her. And the real story of this, how I started writing with her and then for her, we were friends and I was paying my student loans in graduate school. And she had to meet with her architect. And I was upset about making a bill. And she said, oh, well, come up with an idea and we'll pay off your student loans. And I was like, okay. So she went to meet with her architect, and I came up with an idea for a book movie later that day, a couple hours later. And she said, oh, I like that. Okay, I can sell it. She made a few phone calls, and by the end of the day, we had a deal memo that not only paid off my student loans, but also gave her her large cut of it. And that's how I became a writer.
Well done.
Well, so I wrote for her and with her, and I don't say I ghosted, although it wasn't like she said I wrote it and she signed her name at the end. We collaborated, but I was not mentioned in the, she got all the credit for that, and we had a division of the money, and it was going great, and she was incredibly successful, and I thought I would do that for the rest of my life, and then she died suddenly and very publicly. And I thought, oh boy, what am I going to do? She was, of course, my friend, but also my boss. I was writing women's fiction and chick lit, mostly Upper West Side divorcee voice, which is also my personal voice. So I wrote some chick lit, and I wrote a book that we were going to do next. And it went to auction, which is great. And I did it, I never mentioned her. I did it all on my own. It goes to auction. And the day of the auction, they find out I'm a man. And, we've been speaking about masculinity. It's oh, here it comes to bite me in the ass on the other way. And the auction is canceled. No one goes. It's at a time where this is how could we promote this? This wouldn't work. So that dies. And then I think, well, I'm with that agent, and that agent says, there's a call for these tween books from Simon and Schuster. Do you think you could come up with something? So I took our ideas that we had written for divorcees on the Upper West Side and translated them to 13-year-old girls. And then I wrote multiple series for Simon and Schuster. And I was happily writing tween books, and I would do readings. And because we've been talking about this also, I would do readings, and it would be me, Jenny Han, who's of course, gone to incredible success, and some other very successful writers. And we do a school assembly, and they would have all the boys leave and go play basketball while I and the other writers spoke to the girls. I mean, like awful, right? I just kept thinking about the boy in the basketball gymnasium who is like peeking through the window, desperate to see us talk about our books. And that kid, is obviously me. But I wrote tween books, and I people would be surprised that I was a guy. And I would say, well, I'm not a 13-year-old girl, but neither are any of the people writing the books. So we're all using our imagination. And then thanks to the overlord algorithm, I kept getting gay romance in my algorithm feed, and I started reading that. And I was like, oh, this is a thing. Let me try that. So that's how I got where I am today writing.
That's awesome. That's a great story. We haven't had one like that on the show, I think, ever.
It's a weird, long one. I'm sorry.
So besides more in the two series that we've talked about, is there anything else you can kind of tease us about what's coming up next?
I have the Love Beyond Boundaries books that are coming out with travel. And then I am going back to my roots and doing a rom-com. It's called Miles of Style. And it's a bit of a Prince and the Pauper that takes place at a queer lifestyle television program over New Year's Eve.
Oh, fun. Cool.
Yeah.
And what's the best way for everyone to keep up with you online so they can keep track of all this stuff?
I'm most active on Instagram. I can really relate to things visually, so you can find me there. I have almost no followers on Twitter, and I don't really tweet, but you can find me there. You can become one of my many, many dozens of followers, and not even up to dozens. I only probably have under a dozen. And you can also join my newsletter, which I'd be so thrilled about, because I have about 12 people on it. I'm related to 6 and married to 1. So please sign up for that. And because I wrote for tweens, I always respond to emails. I've never not responded to an email that I can think of from a reader. So you can always email me.
Very cool. Well, of course, we will link to all that stuff in the show notes so that people can track you down and start following you as this book comes out.
Mm-hmm.
Now, before we wrap up, because it is Pride Month, tell us what Pride means to you.
In my 20s, when I was in New York, Pride was really about flipping the script. Like, it made New York gay for a day in like this very powerful way. Like, everything was gay. And that was absolutely what Pride meant. It meant like being part of a large group. Now that I'm older and married for a long time, we go to smaller Pride events out here in Bucks County. And for us, I think at those, I think there are as many people who identify as gay as there are people who probably don't. And it's not about flipping the script as it was in New York. It's more about being in a place where everybody is acknowledging our differences, but coming together in a way through sameness. So Pride has meant different things to me over the years, but small town Pride is where my heart is these days.
Thank you for sharing that with us. I like that small town Pride kind of thing, because it's not a piece of the Pride puzzle that we hear a lot. It's all centered in the bigger cities.
Right. Small town Pride is growing. We have 2 small town Prides within 10 minutes of each other. Doylestown and New Hope both have Pride celebrations.
Well, Philip, thank you so much for coming on the show, kicking off Pride Month for us, and telling us all about the Hideaway Inn. I wish you the most success with that book.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been so much fun to talk to you.